Hi folks, welcome back to the Tabletop's Edge and our continuing tutorial series on World in Flames, the Collector's Edition. Today, we're going to take a look at the naval combat system in WIF, and I want to put a viewer advisory right up front. I'm going to try to keep this video to a reasonable length, and because the naval combat subsystem is one of the more involved subsystems in the game, there may be some details or some special cases that I might not mention in the course of today's video. So it's very important that you do in fact go through and read the entire naval combat section in the rules, which is section 11.5, and it runs from page 24 through 29. The goal of this video, as with the rest of the tutorial series, is to give you a working knowledge of the rules so that when you sit down to play a game, you'll have some idea of kind of what's going on, and to hopefully make some of the legalese that the rulebook uses a little clearer to you. So with that in mind, let's not waste any more time and let's jump right in. We'll begin with an overview of the naval combat procedure. I'll sort of list all of the steps that are involved, and then we'll go back and look at each of those individual steps in greater detail. Now, as you can see, naval combat occurs after all of the active side's naval movement has been completed, and there are two exceptions to that. The first are port attacks, which is a form of naval air combat in which the active side's aircraft, both carrier-based and land-based, conduct naval air attacks against enemy ships that are still in port. The other exception is naval interception, which occurs during the active side's movement. The inactive side, if they have naval or air units in a section of the sea box of a sea zone in which the active side is moving through, they will have an opportunity, if they desire, to attempt to intercept that movement before that task force has completed its movement. Other than that, most of your combat is going to occur right here in step D of the action stage of your impulse. You'll see also step E is opponent's naval combat. And after the active side has the opportunity to initiate all of the naval combat it desires, the inactive side will then have an opportunity to attempt to initiate naval combat in those sea areas where the active side chose not to. So, what are the steps involved in naval combat sequence? Let's take a look. Now, like air-to-air combat, naval combat is fought in a series of rounds. However, unlike air combat and land combat for that matter, naval combat is never a given. Both sides will essentially have to search, and if neither side has a successful search, no naval combat will occur. Now, the naval combat sequence involves the active player going sea zone by sea zone and initiating naval combat where he desires. Now, the steps in that procedure are: first, you will initiate a combat in a sea area. Then both sides can fly aircraft into the area. This is known as Naval Air Interception. Then both sides, with the active side first, are going to commit their subs, or rather make the decision whether or not they're going to commit their subs to the upcoming potential combat. Then you will search for the enemy. If neither side finds the other, the combat's over and you move on to the next sea zone. If, however, at least one side is successful, you then have to determine the type of combat. And there are three types of naval combat. You have surface combat, naval air combat, or submarine combat. You then resolve that combat. Both sides then may voluntarily abort the combat, the active side again making his decision first after that initial round of combat. If both sides have units remaining in the sea zone, then you're going to go back up to the point where both sides can then again fly any aircraft into the sea zone. You will then have an opportunity to commit your subs again, and then search for the enemy, resolve the combat if you find it, and so on, and continuing that process until neither side successfully searches to begin another round of combat, or one side has either been aborted voluntarily or sunk in the process of the combat, leaving only one side one side's units in that C zone. So that's kind of the overview. Now let's go back and take a look at each of these 8 steps in a little more detail. Now here we have, as an example to help you visualize how the naval combat works, some Kriegsmarine units and some Royal Navy units here in the Bay of Biscay. And I've taken the stacks and spread them out so that you can see the contents of all the stacks. And you'll see the Royal Navy has units in both the 4 section and the 3 section, while the Germans have some surface ships in the 4 section and submarines in both the 3 section and the 1 section. Now, we'll assume that it's the Commonwealth player is the active player. He has just completed all of his naval movement and now wishes to initiate naval combat in the Bay of Biscay in an attempt to sink the German ships. In order to initiate combat in a sea area, you must turn one of your face-up units in that sea area face down in order to be able to initiate that combat. So, if it were a case where, for whatever reason, the Commonwealth's units were all face down, the Commonwealth would be unable to initiate combat in the sea zone. Fortunately for them, they have 4 units that are face up, and it does not matter which unit you turn face down, you simply have to turn one of them face down. You could even use an air unit if you had some air units flying naval air missions in this sea zone. And in fact, if you have chosen an air impulse type, for this impulse, you would have to turn over an air unit in order to initiate the naval combat. Now, you can also turn over a submarine if, for instance, it were the German player who was the active player and he wanted to initiate combat. He could select one of his submarines and turn it face down, even if he then does not include that submarine or any of his submarines in the upcoming naval combat. Now, you don't need to have moved a unit into the sea area in the impulse to initiate combat. And you can still pick an area even if you fought an interception combat there during the naval movement step. Now, once you have initiated a combat in that sea zone, both sides, starting with the active side first, has the opportunity to do what's known as Naval Air Interception. This is simply an opportunity for both sides to fly any air units into the sea zone that they desire to participate in the upcoming naval combat. And in this example here, the Commonwealth has no aircraft that are within range or that are eligible to engage in the combat. However, the Germans do have a couple of naval air units based here on the coast of France that they would like to add to the sea zone for the upcoming naval combat. And when you fly your naval air interception missions, they work exactly like a regular naval air mission, with a couple of exceptions. The big one to note is that you may only use half range of your bombers or your aircraft because you are not limited to flying just naval aircraft, naval air bombers into the sea zone. You can also fly fighters. So whichever aircraft you fly, the range is going to be halved, and then they would enter one of the sections of the sea box. So with a range of 13, this German flying boat would have a range of 6.5, which rounds to 7. It spends 1 to reach a C dot. It would then spend 2 for the 1 box, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and it would be able to enter the 3 box. The other flying boat only has a range of 9, which would be halved to 5, and it would spend 1 to reach a C dot, then 2, 3, 4, and it does not have enough to enter the 3 box, so the German would place it in the 2 box. These aircraft then are available to potentially participate in the upcoming combat. Once all naval air interception has been flown, it's time for both sides to commit units to the combat. Now, if it is blizzard or storm, you cannot commit any aircraft units. All of your non-submarine units will automatically be committed to the battle. However, your submarine units may be committed to the battle at your option. If you do decide to commit the subs to the naval combat, you must commit all of your subs. So it's an all or nothing deal with your submarines. However, it is possible for you to leave them out of the fight entirely. In this particular example, assuming the weather is rain, fine, or snow, the Commonwealth would have all 4 units automatically committed to the combat. The German player would have his 3 surface ships automatically committed, as well as both of his aircraft units, and then he would have to decide and declare whether or not he was including both of his submarines or neither of his submarines. Now, once both sides have announced their commitment, and again, it's the active side announces whether or not he's committing his submarines before the inactive side, you then move on to the search roll. Now, in order for naval combat to actually occur, both sides will need to search, and they will do so by rolling 1 die, and they need to roll less than or equal to the search number in the sections of the C box where they have units. There are 3 ways that you can modify this search number, and there are both modifications to the search number itself, as well as a couple of modifications to the search roll. And it's important, as we will see shortly, that you don't confuse the two. So there is a difference between increasing the search number versus a modification to the die roll. Now, this search number can be modified by +1 if there is a naval air unit in the section of the C box. Now, it has to be a naval air unit, so no fighters, no land bombers, but an actual naval air unit, the abbreviation NAV, as you see in the rule book, and it adds 1 to this section. The important thing about the different sections of the C box are only your units that are in a section of the C box whose search number is equal to or greater than the die roll will be able to participate in the combat. So it may be a case where only the German units in the 4 box participate, or maybe just the German units in the 2, 3, and 4 box, depending upon how the German player would roll. Note that your search roll has 0 effect on determining which of the enemy units will participate in the combat. So back to the search number modifiers. You get a +1 to that box if it has a naval air unit. So while this is a 4, this 3, because of the presence of the German naval air here, would also be a 4, and this 2 box, because of this German naval air unit, would be a 3. So if there were no other modifiers in effect, on a roll of 3 or less, all 3 of these German units, the units in those 3 German boxes, would participate in the upcoming combat. You can also add +1 to the search number if there is a carrier plane in that box with a range of 4 or more on an undamaged aircraft carrier. So if the British had HMS Indomitable in the 4 box, the range of its air component is 5. Remember, it's 3 + 2 from our prior video on aircraft carriers, making this search number actually a 5 for the Commonwealth. So were the Commonwealth in this situation to roll a 5, only these 3 units would participate in the upcoming round of naval combat. The third modification you can make to a search number is if you have a carrier plane with a range of 7 or more. So 4 or more on your carrier range will give you a +1. 7 or more gives you a +2 to that search number. Now, I mentioned modifiers to the search number. There are also 2 modifiers that may apply to your search die roll. The first is a +1 to the die roll in rain, snow, storm, or blizzard. The other modifier is a -1 to the roll for every 10 enemy convoy points or portion thereof that are in the C zone. Now, it's important that the convoy point modifier does not apply during storm, blizzard, port attacks, or the first round of naval interception combat. That's the naval combat that occurs during the active side's movement phase. So in this particular example right here, assuming that we have fine weather, the German search number would be modified by +1 in the 2 box and the 3 box. And then the German search die roll would be modified by a -2 because we have 15 Commonwealth convoy points in the C zone. Now, once you have calculated any die roll modifiers to the search rolls as well as any modifiers to the search numbers, each side is going to roll 1 die for their search roll. And there are 3 possible outcomes. Either both sides succeed in their searches, only one side succeeds in its search, or neither side succeeds in its search roll. Now, in the case of neither side succeeding in their search roll, naval combat is done for that sea zone for this impulse, and you would move on to the next sea area. In the case where both sides roll equal to or less than the highest search roll of one of their boxes, you would then determine which units will be involved in the combat. So, for both sides to roll, if the Allies were to roll a 5 in this case, and the Germans were to roll a 4, the German search number in the 4 box is a 4. The 3 box has been modified by a +1 thanks to the Naval Air, making it a 4. And since both of the search numbers in both of those sections is equal to or greater than the die rolled, all of the units in both of those sections will be able to participate in the combat. The Naval Air unit in the 2 box and the submarine in the 1 box, assuming the German decided to include his submarines in the combat, would not take part in the combat and are essentially ignored for the rest of the naval combat for this round. For the Commonwealth, they rolled a 5. If the HMS Indomitable were part of the task force, that would modify the search number to a 5, thus allowing these 3 naval units to participate in this round of naval combat. However, HMS Malaya and HMS Mauritius would not be able to participate. Now, without the Indomitable, this 5 indicates that the Commonwealth failed to successfully search. In this case, only one side has succeeded, the German side. After the German player determines which of his units will be able to participate, he then selects at least one, or more if you prefer, sections of the sea box to include in the coming combat of enemy units. So we're talking just enemy units here. If, for instance, he were to select the 3 box and only the 3 box, only HMS Malaya and Mauritius would participate in the combat. He could select the 0 box and fight a rather bloodless fight against the convoy points alone. Now keep in mind that when you pick the box, that's only the enemy units in those sections of the sea box are participating, not yours. So had the Naval Air unit not been present in the 3 box, but was down here in the 1 box, with this 4, the submarine would not be included, even if the German selected the 3 box to include in the combat. It was only the enemy units when you're choosing which section to include. Your units are always determined by your dice roll and the search number as modified in the section of the sea box they occupy. So once you determine which units are going to be involved in the combat, you then proceed to calculate surprise points. And surprise points are based on the search number of the box as well as the search roll. And this is why it's important to keep straight whether you're modifying the search number or the search roll. Each side will receive surprise points equal to the search number, the modified search number of the highest section of the sea box that has units included in the combat, plus the opponent's search roll. So continuing this example, had the Germans rolled a 4, the Commonwealth rolled a 5, only the Germans have succeeded, and they would choose which section or sections of Commonwealth units to include in the combat, along with all of their units in the 3 and 4 box. In this case, if the Germans selected the Commonwealth units in the 4 box and only the 4 box, the Germans would receive surprise points equal to 4, which is the highest search number of a box they have units included in, plus 5 for a total of 9. The Commonwealth would receive 4, since the units they have included in the combat are in the 4 box, plus the 4 of the German roll for a total of 8. You then subtract the lower amount from the larger amount, and whoever has more surprise points gets to spend the difference between the two in the upcoming naval combat. Now, if instead of choosing the 4 box, the Germans had decided that they were going to attack the convoy points in the 0 box, the Germans would receive 4 surprise points for the highest section they have included, plus 5 for the enemy's search roll for a total of 9. However, now the Commonwealth, since the only section they have included in the combat is in the 0 box, they would receive 0 plus the German roll of 4 for a total of 4. The difference in surprise points now is plus 5 to the Germans, so the Germans would be able to spend up to 5 surprise points in the coming round of naval combat. Now, what do you spend those surprise points on? Let's take a look. Now, there's a chart on page 26 of the rulebook which breaks down how you can spend your surprise points. That chart is also reproduced to the right of the naval combat chart in the player aid. And you can see you've got several options for how to spend your surprise points. Keep in mind that the side that had the lower total of surprise points, which may be 0 in some cases, if you're, for instance, if your major power is surprised, you will get 0 surprise points on the impulse that you were surprised. They do not get to spend any surprise points. The only side that gets to spend any surprise points is the side that had the higher total, and then they are going to spend the difference between their surprise points and the other sides. So in our example, the Germans chose the 0 box to attack the Commonwealth convoy points, giving them 9 to the Commonwealth's 4 for a net difference of 5. How can the Germans spend those 5 surprise points? First, they can spend 4 surprise points to avoid combat entirely. And this is a good idea if you happen to, say, roll well and your opponent rolls really poorly, you're heavily outnumbered, you don't want to risk any combat, and so you can simply spend 4 of your surprise points to avoid combat. That will end combat in this sea zone for this step, and you would go on to the next sea area. You could also spend 4 surprise points to choose the combat type. Now remember, there are 3 types of naval combat. It's either going to be a surface combat, a naval air combat, or a submarine combat. And there is a priority to determining what type of combat that is. However, you can short circuit that process by simply spending 4 surprise points to choose the type of combat that you want. And you may choose a combat type that will result in no combat. For instance, if you were to have only naval air units in the sea zone, you could still select a surface combat type, which would not affect your naval air units, and therefore there would be no combat, and you would proceed on to the rest of the procedure. You would roll search rolls again for the next round of combat and so on. So 4 points to avoid combat, 4 points to choose combat. When you get into the combat itself, you can spend 3 points to select a target, and this is either side. You may also spend 2 to increase your column on the naval combat chart, or spend 2 points to decrease your opponent's column. Finally, you can spend 2 points to increase your air-to-air value, or 2 points to decrease your enemy's air-to-air value. Now, you spend your surprise points as you go along. So at the appropriate point in the naval combat procedure, you would spend your points depending upon what you're going to spend them on. For instance, at the beginning, you would spend 4 to avoid combat or choose the combat type, but you would wait until you determined it was a naval air combat before spending points to increase or decrease your air-to-air value or decrease your opponent's air-to-air value. Now, once you've calculated the surprise points available to one side or the other, you'll need to determine what the combat type for the upcoming round of naval combat will be. However, since we're already kind of over the time length that I like to keep these tutorial videos to, we're going to have to pick that up next time in part 2 of naval combat. So stay tuned. We'll get this one uploaded presently, and I will follow up with the rest of the naval combat tutorial very shortly. Thanks for watching again. Take care, and we'll see you next time.